Welcome to the Free Mind Podcast, and welcome to our first episode of our God and Government series. We're super excited to have our special guest with us today. His name is Lawrence W. Reed, and he is the President Emeritus of the Foundation of Economic Education.
FEE, for short.
Known as FEE, and the author and sometimes an editor of several books, including Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism, and Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. Prior to joining FEE in 2008, he served for 20 years as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and he also taught economics full-time for nearly a decade. A frequent guest on radio and television, Reed has written thousands of articles and delivers dozens of speeches each year. And he's also appeared on Prager University promoting his recent book that we are going to discuss today. We're excited, and it's called Was Jesus a Socialist? So we're going to dig in deep today.
Yep, looking forward to that. Thanks for coming on here, Dr. Reed. We really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure, Seth and Irva. It's a real honor to be with you. Thanks for thinking of me.
Oh, well, the whole reason we really brought you on here is because we want you to solve a problem for us today. We're out here in the San Francisco Bay, California area, and we can't seem to get our AC fixed. We brought somebody out, and they said everything's working fine. And then today they gave us a text asking, I guess, everybody in the area would we turn down our electronic devices and even turn off our air to save electricity for other people. So we wanted you to help us get the connection between socialism and our AC not working as we're here dying and sweating during this interview.
Yeah, we'll try to stay cool.
Well, again, the problem is probably a publicly owned, which means government-run utility, and maybe the best solution for the long run is to sell it, privatize it.
There you go, privatize.
That's good. Well, if you're watching us on YouTube, you will see that we will be probably sweating profusely because it literally is 86 degrees in this apartment right now, and it's
so bad.
It's rough here. So we're really roughing it for you guys to get this interview because we believe in it. But as we jump in today, we're going to talk about your book. Maybe before we get into the theology elements, though, it might be helpful for many people who don't really know what socialism is. We kind of hear these terms thrown around, mostly the marketing of, free stuff, paying for college tuition, free healthcare, all this kind of stuff wrapped into these bundles. And I did notice early on in your book, you said that in May 2016, a Gallup poll revealed that 55% of 18 to 29-year-olds had a positive image of socialism. That was in 2016. Well, in 2019, you say that a Harris poll showed that half of Americans aged 18 to 39, which puts me in the upper edge of that, said they would, quote, prefer living in a socialist country, unquote. A 2019 report by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation revealed that more than 70% of millennials said they were likely to vote for a socialist. What's going on here, Dr. Reed? Help us understand, why are all these, folks in our category opting for socialism?
Great question. There's no doubt about it that the overwhelming majority of those who responded favorably to those polls, I'm sure, are of the best of intentions. The problem typically is that they've been sold socialism on the packaging, not on the content. And the packaging often looks like this. Oh, socialism will care for people. It will give you things. It will relieve you of responsibilities. It will punish rich people and give the proceeds to you. And, to a lot of people who may be idealistic or may not be well-versed in economics, that sounds like, wow, I think people will be better off after we do that. But then when you look at the content of socialism, what actually happens, not just the rhetoric and the promises, but the actual performance of the system over centuries, it hasn't worked even once. It produces a concentration of political power. Lord Acton told us 150 years ago that political power is corrupt. It corrupts people, and the more of it you have, the more corrupting it is. And in terms of economic performance, those things that actually end up feeding and clothing and housing people, it doesn't perform well on that score either, because it strips away the incentives of productive people to create, to innovate, to start businesses, and it punishes the people who are successful at doing that. So it's a lot of promises that people have been sold, and it sounds good if that's as deep as you get. But you go a little deeper and you discover the devil's in the details, maybe in more ways than one.
Yeah, I would imagine that's true. And, you know, would you also say part of it, we don't really get a good education in history anymore either, particularly with economics?
Yeah, you know, history actually is my first love, even more so than economics. And I constantly lament how little we really are teaching young people these days in history, and how perverted it often is to serve political agendas instead of, you know, what actually happened, good or bad. It's a shame, but that's the temper of our times, I guess. We have to hope and pray that we can change that so that people look at history more objectively and honestly. Doesn't mean we'll end up all agreeing on what happened, but at least we should agree on the facts of what happened. We can interpret them differently, but the facts are the facts.
Right. Now that's old school.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It should be current.
Well, you're talking to an old timer.
So let's dive into socialism. Would you give us, for those listeners who have never taken a course or are not history lovers, tell us, what is socialism?
Okay, great question, Nerva, because, you know, even socialists don't always agree on what it is, and they haven't over the decades. At one time, most people, even socialists, agreed that socialism meant the government ownership of the means of production. But everywhere that's been tried, most notably the old Soviet Union, it was a complete, unmitigated flop. And so socialists these days typically say, oh, well, no, we really didn't mean that. So they may mean just government planning of the economy. We'll leave a lot of it in private hands, they say. We won't have government nationalizing everything. But everybody who owns these things will be essentially told what to do. We're going to plan the economy from the top so it'll be fair. And of course, that's a flop everywhere it's tried too. The very idea that you could have a handful of elite with political power pushing other people around and shaping their economy for them is ridiculous. Now, more often than not, people who claim to be socialists say, well, it's really just a welfare state. That's what we mean, where the government will tax the wealthy heavily and fork over the proceeds to various special interest groups, not just the needy, but special industries that we like or whatever it may be. So it depends on, you know, who you're talking to, what socialism is. But here's a definition maybe we can agree on, because it kind of boils it all down, regardless of what its objectives may be. Socialism is the concentration of power and the use of force, it's not voluntary, to achieve central planning, government ownership of the means of production, or a welfare state, or some combination of the three. That's what it amounts to. And the key word there is force, because the number one thing that differentiates it from, say, capitalism is opposite, is that it isn't voluntary. If you just listen to socialists, they never say, well, here's a list of suggestions for you. No, they have an endless roster of things they want to impose, that they want to forcibly mandate on people. Whether it be through higher taxes or government programs. It's not a list of suggestions for the comment box. Socialism is force, legal and political, from the top, and that emanates from the concentration of political power into the hands of those who are in charge of government.
Wow. No, I like that. I like the way you distilled that down. And, you know, you mentioned this a little bit ago, that Russia kind of being one of the prime, or the USSR, I guess, would have been one of the prime examples. You also have the Nazi form of socialism in Hitler's Germany. And then you got the modern examples, I guess, of Venezuela and some of the other Latin American countries. And they all seem to be like awful, murderous, totalitarian governments. How are people then trying to put a positive spin if that's the, like, not even just 8 out of 10 cases, but you're looking at 10 out of 10, 100% where this model has been tried, that it's ended in this, just murderous, awful, dystopian type situation. How are people trying to put a positive spin on that these days to sell socialism?
More often than not, socialists will change the subject and not try to put a positive spin on some of those things. If you press them, many times they'll say, well, that wasn't really what we intended. That just went bad in that case. The wrong people got in charge. We'll get it right the next time. After centuries of that kind of excuse, it's getting a little tiresome, but that's what a lot of them say. Well, we'll just try better next time. In other words, they really don't get to the fundamentals and realize that socialism doesn't just fail in practice, it fails in theory too, because it springs from the notion that man can be perfected by the introduction of political force. We just have to have the right people to tell them what to do, and we can make men as close to perfect as is possible, and that somehow people exercising that total power can be magnanimous about it. They don't understand the history and elemental principles of human nature. One of the most eternal lessons to be learned from history and our study of political science and of human nature is that human beings are fallen. They are flawed. And so there are certain things you never want to give any of them in a total sense. And one of them is power. And no human being is capable of exercising total power or even close to it without sooner or later being corrupted by it. The lust for power, I think, which is at the core of socialism, certainly in practice, if not in theory, is probably the most corrupting influence or motivation in the history of humankind. It has taken even good people and just ground them up into dust, turned them into evil people, because of what it does to the mind. It just, look at Robespierre, the French Revolution. Before the revolution, he was deemed a kind of moderate. He was opposed to the death penalty and so forth. And then he gets in charge and it gets intoxicated with power and starts lopping off heads by the hundreds with the guillotine. That is a sad lesson that should not have to be relearned all the time, but we have to learn it because a lot of people think, well, next time, we'll be better at it.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I knew about Robespierre and the guillotine. I didn't know he was against the death penalty before that. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
As you're saying that, just to kind of put it down more to a ground level, why is it that the idea of this centralized planning tends to lead towards bad economies? Because it sounds like, man, why not put our best thinkers, all in a room together and plan this thing out? Doesn't planning help? Why does it lead to that?
Well, the Nobel laureate economist, F.A. Hayek, explained this very well when he said that that knowledge is not concentrated in individual people. It's widely diffused. We all know maybe a lot about our little corner of the universe, but none of us and no collection of us would ever know enough to be able to make the decisions that could govern an economy of hundreds of millions of people. It's a pretense to knowledge, as Hayek would put it, for any group of people to think that they could possibly know that much. The founder of our foundation for economic education, Leonard Read, wrote a great essay in 1958. It's been a classic over the years called I, Pencil. Have either of you heard of I, Pencil before?
I don't think so. Outside maybe the book mentioned.
Yeah, you mentioned.
Oh, okay. I just mentioned it.
Chapters.
In your listeners, and you can access it at fee.org, but he tells the story of how a pencil comes into being, and he does it as if it's the pencil doing the talking. And the pencil says, well, I may seem pretty simple, but I'm extraordinarily complicated. For you to know how to make me, you would have to be a logger. You'd have to know, what trees serve best as the wood portion of me. And you'd have to know how to log those trees. You'd have to be a miner to get the graphite that goes in the middle. You'd have to be a miner also to get the metal that forms the ferrule at one end. And you'd have to be an expert in trees to know which ones produce the material that creates the eraser. And there's just a million tasks that go into making a pencil. And the bottom line of that essay is no one person in the world knows how to make a pencil entirely by himself from scratch with only his own knowledge. And think about that. I mean, that is profound. If somebody told you you're not allowed to look at a pencil or anybody who knows anything about them from scratch, you go out and make one.
Wow.
You couldn't do it. And so when somebody says, oh, well, but a handful of politically empowered people can plan an economy, we shouldn't debate them so much as to declare that to be preposterous. Why should we even debate that? Because none of them even know how to make a pencil. And yet they claim to know how to plan an economy of 330 million people. Give me a break. It's ridiculous. But that's what a lot of socialists have that in their minds, that, hey, you know, if we can just do such wondrous things, if you just give us the power and concentrate it, because, you know, when we're not concentrating power, then people are running off doing their own thing, and that might not be what I want them to do. Well, that's what freedom is all about, frankly. But socialists really don't appreciate that.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you think about it like that, there's just no way. This is so complicated. And I was listening to an economist recently. I wish I could remember his name, but he was saying how when you take away the free market like that, you lose your signals, your feedback signals. He said it would be like trying to get around New York City without street signs. And so you don't know which direction you're going. You don't know where you are. And without that free market feedback, having that centralized planning, you end up inevitably taking wrong ways. Yeah. So is that one aspect of a good analogy, I guess, for what you're saying?
Yes, it is. It's a very important one. The great economist Ludwig von Mises in the 1920s was the man who pointed this out, and the socialists have never answered it effectively since. He pointed out that socialism can't work because it cannot plan. It has an inability, as he put it, to calculate. Prices in a socialized system are just the arbitrary whims of politicians and the bureaucrats. And so they don't know what they're doing. They don't know whether something ought to be charged this much, that much. But in the free market, when prices are free to relate to things like supply and demand, consumer preferences, and so forth, prices carry immense amounts of information. They tell us in a free market that, well, hey, this item, we got enough of. You don't need to make any more of that. Free up resources to make something else, because the price of that thing will fall. When prices go up, that sends the message that, wow, more people want more of this. So divert some resources to meet that demand. Prices send signals. They allocate scarce resources and they direct production, as long as they're free to reflect market forces of consumer preference and supply and demand. You strip all that away, then they just become arbitrary declarations by bureaucrats. That's why when the centrally planned economies of the old Soviet Union created such havoc, and it piled up surpluses of one thing and shortages of another, and it was just such chaos. A socialist theoretician said, well, we have to solve this problem, so let's just get a Sears catalog from the United States, and we'll approximate their prices, which is an admission that socialism can't work.
That's really interesting. Wow.
That's crazy.
And I think the other part of it that stood out to both Nerv and I, one of the analogies that people have seen going around the internet is the whole getting a grade in a classroom, and how it de-incentivizes hard work, because who's going to work harder if you're going to get the same result whether you work hard or not? So if they're just going to take all the test scores in a room and average them out to a mean average, you're not going to do that extra work to get an A+ so you can be pulled down to a D or a C or an F or whatever it might be. It just it de-incentivizes and works against human nature. And so I think you point that out. Anything you'd want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, that's totally right. And we fail sometimes, certainly socialists do, to remember that human beings are creatures of incentives and disincentives. We respond. If we are rewarded for something, we tend to do more of it. If we're penalized for it, we do less of it. And in a free market, you're rewarded for things like work and thrift and investment and savings and risk-taking and entrepreneurship. In a socialized system, you tend to get rewarded to the extent you serve the state instead of consumers. but incentives are really critical. Just ask yourself, uh, do you know anybody on this planet who would work harder for the state, the distant, faceless bureaucracy of the state, than they would to working for either themselves or their family? I mean, it's just the way we are. And thankfully, that is the way we are. I'm glad we don't work as hard for a faceless bureaucracy as we work for ourselves and our families.
All right, so talk to us about, it seems like in socialism, one of the main things that happens at first is that the takeaway of private property, if I understand correctly, and that alone can affect just the dignity of humans, and also the way just buildings or neighborhoods begin to kind of just get run down because there's no one taking responsibility over the properties. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Private property is so key in human progress that you take it away and progress disappears, or certainly becomes far more difficult. And that's again because we're creatures of incentive. We tend to do better and work harder and smarter whenever we can say the fruits of that effort, at least some of it or a lot of it, will be mine. Not somebody else's, but mine, because I'm the one who worked for it. Again, it's an observation about human nature that suggests that private property is critical. If you want to trash the resources of society fully, all you have to do is take property from those who created it or to whom it belongs and give it to a politician to spend or take care of as he wishes. That's a surefire way to destroy something of value. I have a very good friend who was Prime Minister of Mongolia twice and President twice. And the first time he was Prime Minister, he was coming into power shortly after the demise of communism. And he visited with me in Michigan at that time. And I said, what are you most proud of with your time as Prime Minister? And he gave me a great story with a lesson about private property. He said, well, the first time, he said, I was only in the office for about a year, and all of the yaks, those big hairy Mongolian cattle, all of the yaks in Mongolia belonged to the government for 75 years under communism. They couldn't be owned privately. And the herdsmen who took care of them were doing so as government employees. And he said, over 75 years, the population of yaks never changed. It was 25 million over 75 years. And he said, I decided when I was Prime Minister that yaks were not a core function of government. So he said, I decided, we were going to sell them. So he said, I worked out a formula where we could sell the yaks to the herdsmen. Some bought one, some bought two, some bought 5 or 10. But in no time, he said, we privatized all 25 million of them and got them out of the hands of the government. Suddenly they belonged to the people who had previously been told to take care of them. And then 3 years later, I visited him when he was Prime Minister a second time. And in his office, I asked him, what happened to the yaks that you privatized 3 years ago, that you turned from government property into private property? And he got all excited. He said, remember I told you the population never changed? It was 25 million for 75 years. I said, yeah. And he said, well, now, after just 3 years, we have 32 million yaks.
Wow.
And what was the difference? The fact that the herdsman now could say, well, this is my yak. So I better take care of him. I've made an investment here. And if I only have one, maybe it makes sense for me to get a second one and raise more yaks. And in just 3 years' time, the population went through the roof. They were exporting yak meat and so forth. The difference was simply private property. It makes all the difference in the world. If you don't own it, you're not going to take care of it. If it's owned by everybody, as the socialists like to claim, the people's property, then everybody has an incentive to use it, even abuse it, but no incentive to take care of it.
Oh.
That just proves itself time and time again. I don't know why we have to keep telling socialists that, but they keep thinking that, well, someday everybody will behave differently and human nature will go by the boards and people will do what we tell them. Hey, good luck with that.
Wow. Is there such a thing as democratic socialism, and what's the difference?
Uh, well, in this sense, that some people claim there is, then
Okay,
yeah, I guess
gotcha.
something that we have to at least address. Can you imagine anybody claiming democratic Nazism?
Ooh.
And yet you could, because Hitler came to power democratically in the
Mm.
elections in 1932. But of course, nobody would ever claim that. Nobody would want any kind of his brand of socialism, democratic or not. But that was socialism, by the way. Hitler was a socialist. His party was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. I just had some differences with the Soviet version because he wanted Russian territory and Russia didn't want him to have it,
Mm.
just proving there's no honor among thieves. I know there
Mm.
are people who claim today that, we don't want to have the kind of socialism that involves tanks and, Stalin-esque policies. We want it to all be democratic. We want people to vote for this stuff. And so when they do, that somehow sanctifies it and we can call it democratic. But if the end result is the same, I'm not sure how much the democracy side of things makes a difference. But the problem is, the more socialism you have, the more it tends to undermine the democratic portion. I mean, if
Yeah.
the more you concentrate power, the more government is going to tell you how to behave, how to vote, and whether or not there are some things you can vote on and whether you can't. I mean, the last
Mm.
thing you want to do if you want to preserve, broad-based people power is to concentrate power in a handful of government politicians. So that term is at war with itself.
Mm.
You can only have the democratic side for so long, and if you don't get rid of the socialist side, it will get rid of the democratic side.
Yeah, that's,
So good.
and that has been, at least for what I can tell, the tendency lately of the Democratic Party
You know,
has been to adopt that language. And then typically what I hear them saying was, well, we don't mean socialism of the Russian, Venezuelan stripe. What we mean is the socialism in Denmark, Sweden, the Nordic or Scandinavian countries. Um, what would your response be to that?
yeah, that still comes up quite a lot. Whenever I hear that, Bernie Sanders, said that a lot during his recent campaign. Every time I heard it, I wanted to say, Bernie, you're 40 years out of date. Uh, the Scandinavian countries, for the better part of the 20th century, had very free economies, very capitalist, and they became among the richer countries of Europe. But then in the post-war period, and for about 30 years, they decided, hey, let's turn away from that. And now that we figured out how to produce a lot of stuff, let's redistribute it. Let's have extensive welfare programs and ever higher
Mm.
taxes. Well, they practiced that for about 30 years, and the result was, in every single case, a flight from that. Those countries for the last 25 years or more have tried to dismantle much of that. In fact, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they are all among the freest countries in the world today. Denmark,
Mm.
actually, on the index of economic freedom, is a few points ahead of the United States. Sweden and Norway are within the first 30 countries on the scale of economic freedom. So they've brought down taxes, they've dismantled much of that socialist structure when they discovered that it didn't work. Those countries now, they don't nationalize industries. They don't have any state-imposed nationwide minimum wage laws. They are globalized free traders. They're much more capitalist, and as a result are doing relatively well. That's why I like to say, if you look around the world and you find a country that you think is at least partly socialist, and it seems to not yet have fallen into disaster, then you might be tempted to say, see, it works. But in every case, what's working is not the socialism they have, it's the capitalism they haven't yet destroyed.
Mm.
Go full socialism, and then you get Venezuela or North Korea or Cuba, and those are unmistakable disasters.
So it's kind of like, it seems like it's almost like a sliding scale. Like on one end you have, the free market, on the other end full on socialism, and kind of the more it tends toward that, the more downside you see economically. I'm guessing more you tend toward this, even in China's case, because people will sometimes refer to them as a successful case of socialism. But from what I would imagine you would say, and I've heard others say, well, their success has actually been due to implementing more free market approaches. Is that kind of what you would say in
Yeah,
that case
and
as
in
well?
fact, you don't have to take my word for it. That's what the Chinese have said.
Right.
When Deng Xiaoping started these economic reforms some 30, 40 years ago, he made it plain that the socialism of the Mao Zedong years had come to a dead end, and he never quite could bring himself to admit to the tens of millions of people who died from it. But at least he said we're not going anywhere with this, and so we have to implement some market reforms. So China now is kind of a hybrid. In economics, they're much freer than they were for decades, and as a result, more economically prosperous. On the political side of things, though, they are still a one-party political monopoly. Uh, Time will tell whether they can retain that.
Yeah, that's good. And when we're having this debate, kind of in our world, when do you think it's a mistake for conservatives every time something moves in a particular area towards socialism to say, oh, this is socialism? Or is there, in other words, I guess, is there a distinction between like a welfare state and socialism, or is the welfare state like applied socialism to certain areas? How would you characterize that?
Well, I think the welfare state is sort of semi-socialist or applied socialism. But I don't think we can keep our rebuttals to it to simply, oh, this is socialism, let's not do that. Because to a lot of people, that sounds like a bumper sticker. It just sounds like a generality. I think we should take each of these proposals that would give us more socialism and explain to people why or what the outcome is likely to be. And if it's harmful, why that would be harmful. That's probably more fruitful than just claiming, it's socialism, therefore just trust us, we shouldn't do it. I mean, that for people like me, that's good enough. But but if you want to persuade a lot of people, you got to go into more detail and explain why it's harmful.
So yeah, I think that's helpful though, what you said, kind of, addressing it case by case and helping people understand what are the pitfalls of this. Because it sounds like, man, I mean, wouldn't you want everybody to have health care and have it all paid for? Or why should we have to pay these high tuition prices? All that kind of stuff sounds on the surface, but then once you dig a little deeper and you realize what that means and what that entails, there's many problems that result.
That's right. Let me just add, if I could, Seth, that part of our task, I think, is to get people to be more thorough in their thinking,
Yeah.
to not be taken in by bumper stickers or false promises, but rather be able to analyze these proposals in a little more depth. And that sometimes requires us to think long term, too, because a lot of what socialism promises sounds like it might be good for the short run, and sometimes it might even be. Maybe the consequences or the effects aren't really felt until a little later. I'm sure if you told the ancient Romans in the early part of their welfare state that, hey, you might not want to go down this path because in a little while your whole civilization is going to go down the tube, they might have said, what? Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But of course, that's what happened. And all the high-sounding rhetoric about the good things government was going to do for them in the long run didn't make any difference.
There's so much learning that we need these days, and that's why I think this will be helpful for many people who haven't ever been able to really think through what it's Jay Richards always says one question you want to ask about economic policy is, and then what will happen?
Yes,
it's not enough to have merely good intentions, but you need to know what are the implications that will follow when we put this policy into place. And I think what you're pointing out is socialism, the implications, and then what will happen is almost always not only negative, but like disastrously negative on every part of an economy. So, what's really interesting to me is how far the Democratic Party as a whole has now just come out, whereas in the past you would hide your socialism and not really want to talk about it, put a different spin on it. But now they're coming right out and saying, we are for socialism. Has that surprised you? And then what do you see for the future of that party? Are they going to continue going down further that path, or do you see them pulling back some? What do you think on that?
Well, it has been more brazen than I thought not so very long ago. I think socialists may feel pretty confident right now that they can push their extreme agenda. They may be right about that. I hope not. I think, however, they're probably miscalculating that there's still across this country a great deal of things that hold a free society together, like civil society activities, people caring for people, starting and supporting volunteer civil society projects and organizations. And there's a rugged individualism that still runs through America. And so I think they're actually going to have a harder time than they might imagine trying to foist their agenda on the American people. Although we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which decades of false teachings in many of our government schools and support for socialism from the major media. We shouldn't underestimate the extent to which those things now present a major problem, that people think it sounds great in too many numbers. So we got to keep working on that for sure.
One of the end goals of socialism is equality.
Yes.
Equality of all mankind. Talk to us about that. Why is that realistic or unrealistic? Because it seems like, oh, we want to look out for all people, and there's different thoughts behind that. But can you touch on that a little bit? That end goal?
Yes. Equality, in one sense, is critically important, should be supported by everybody. And that's the notion of equality before the law, that the law should be unbiased, that the law should be impartial, that it shouldn't tax or regulate or govern in a way that advantages artificially one group over another group. And historically, most of the time in most of the world, the equality before the law has not been achieved. It's something that even in America, we still fall short of, but we have been committed to that as a principle as strongly or more strongly than just about any other country in the history of the world. So that aspect of equality is critically important. Now, socialists will say, oh, we are for that. But then they want to set up all kinds of laws that vilify certain people they don't like. Oh, if you're successful, or if you have this much income or more, then we got to vilify you and take it from you. And, and then they concentrate power in the hands of flawed individuals who the last thing on their minds, the minds of corrupted politicos, is that they should be impartial in their application of the power they wield. That's just not going to happen. That's a pipe dream. But the kind of equality that socialists talk about most of the time is economic equality. Equality in, or something approaching it, in terms of the incomes we earn or the material wealth that we possess, or both. And that is a very dangerous concept. The only way that can be accomplished is through the use of force. You've got to tell people, don't excel, don't be better, don't be different, don't be there first, don't come up with a new idea that everybody else hasn't thought of. You might get a competitive edge, and that would be bad, and that sort of thing. The only way you can prevent economic inequality from materializing is if you tell people by force of law not to do those things, not to innovate, excel, or start a business. We are not the same from one person to another. One of the most remarkable things about human beings is that no two of us who have ever lived have been precisely the same. No two of us. If that had been the case, you'd be saying, in effect, that the same person lived twice. There's no evidence of that. So we're each of us a unique and precious, rare, exceedingly rare commodity. And to be who we were intended to be the unique individuals that we are, you have to give people significant freedom. And they exercise that through the choices they make. And sometimes they make good ones, sometimes they make bad ones. Some people are more risk averse, others are more adept and willing to take risks. I mean, we're different in terms of the talents that we have. And even when we discover what our talent is, or best talent is, different in terms of how hard we work and how long we work and how much we save and how much we invest. Why should anybody think that people of such difference should end up generating the same incomes, the same material wealth in the marketplace? I mean, that's absurd. And yet socialists, they think, well, the more we can move toward everybody having about the same, the better society is. Well, then who's going to take the great risks? Who's going to innovate? Who's going to, you often hear people today even say, oh, the common man, let's glorify the common man. And, there's one sense, and I relate to that, I guess, but in the bigger picture, it's not the common men and women that make such a huge difference in the world. It's the uncommon ones who do all these wonderful entrepreneurial things. So we should not forget that.
Well, I want to get into the theology in just a minute here. Before we do, we just touched on this, but there's two things. One of your quotes in your book, you said, "Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free."
Yeah.
I want you to explain that tension, and then I also, after that, if you will, explain individualism and collectivism.
Okay.
And then with both of those categories, how do we work on that balance? How do we balance those out?
Okay. Free people are not equal, and equal people are not free. This is the first of what I call the 7 principles of sound policies. Just 7 that I happen to choose or write up. Over the years, it's been used in a lot of places, translated in quite a few languages. Again, the equality that this principle refers to is the economic side of things, not equality before the law, which I think we should not really question. That's an ideal. Why shouldn't the law be impartial and honest and fair to everybody? But economically speaking, if people are free, they're not going to be equal. Not equal economically. And that's because, again, we have different talents, we have different degrees of willingness to work and take risks, for a million reasons stemming from the differences that each of us represents from all others. We're not going to generate the same incomes in the marketplace. Why should we expect everybody to come away from the marketplace of exchange, free and willing exchange, earning exactly the same income? Why should they? I mean, that we're not all providing the same service or good of the same value or to the same people. It's just a million reasons why you shouldn't expect free people to be economically equal, that a brain surgeon would earn the same as a custodian. That's absurd. And the second part of that principle, equal people are not free, I think is even more meaningful. It says that if you could find a place in the world where people are equal economically. If you came to me and said, I just came from a country and everybody, regardless of what their contribution was to the marketplace, is earning the same, I would say, without knowing anything else, that has to be an unfree place. Because you can't have economic equality without putting a gun to everybody's head and telling them, now, don't be better, don't be different, don't be there first, don't come up with any good ideas that everybody else doesn't think of, and so forth. Otherwise, you're going to have instant inequality. On the question of individualism versus collectivism, I think the distinction is best understood in the context of a snowstorm. If you think of it from the big picture, you see a snowstorm, it just looks like a blob of white. You don't really at first recognize that it's not just one solid blob, it's actually made up of billions or trillions of individual snowflakes. And to this day, scientists have yet to find 2 snowflakes that are identical. And in a lot of sense, that's the way we are as humans. So if you really want to understand a snowstorm, I mean, there are some things when you look at it from afar, you can learn from it, but you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty and understand the composition of the storm, the flakes that make it up, without which there'd be no storm. And that's true of humankind, too. There would be no humankind, no humanity, if there weren't individuals that composed it. And one of the salient features of individuality is that we are unique one to another. No 2 people who've ever lived have been precisely the same. That tells you, I think, that if you really want to understand humanity, don't ignore what makes it up. What is at the core of it. It's individuals. That's why a good economist will study not collective entities, but rather actual real-world decision-making, thinking entities, individuals, and how their decisions and choices interact with other individuals. You can't separate that and just study the blob without understanding what's really going on here.
And do you think socialism emphasizes the collectivism in a bad way, in an unhealthy way? And if so, how can you do that with individualism as well? Can there be an unhealthy emphasis on either one?
Socialism does emphasize the collective, and in a very arrogant way, it assumes that those in charge can somehow divine the will of the people and implement it across, all of society. They like to gloss over the differences that define us as individuals and try to compress us or homogenize us, you might say, in like a communal blender. And the only way they can do that is through the use of force. But they don't really, they may know individually what they want, but they can't begin to know every aspect of the mentality, the thinking, the ambitions, the choices, the motivations of the individuals that make up society. It's presumptuous and arrogant of them to think that they could. Now, Seth, you had a second part to that question, and I've forgotten it.
Yeah. So, is there an extreme individualism that works its way from the other side?
I think there can be. I mean, let me give you an example of that. If as an individual you say, I don't like any other individual, I don't want to have anything to do with any other individuals. I'm going to even ignore my family because that's other people. The heck with them. Everything is all about just me. I guess that would be an extreme individualist approach, and I think that's untenable. It also runs counter to human nature. I think we are social beings. We're sort of made for each other to cooperate and collaborate and find common ground, not to lord it over each other, not for a few to possess the power that the others don't and then start pushing them around. So I think a free and peaceful people will not choose to be radical individualists. They want to trade, they want to raise their families, they want to deal with other people, and they want to be friends. So, you can have a radical individualist, but boy, they're very few and far between. The greater danger, frankly, comes from the other side of things, the collectivist approach, because that invariably uses political power and force to homogenize people into the plans of the few.
Well, and I know, like, as we go on in this God and Government series, we're going to be kind of getting more into the details of the free market, but just to kind of give us a quick overview, do you think then the free market economically does the best job of balancing freedom, equality, individualism, collectivism? And if so, why does it do that?
Now, one of the great things about a free market, I think, is that at a very fundamental level, it's what happens when you leave people alone. It doesn't have to be planned. Nobody at the top, no king has to say, hey, folks, I think this free market thing is a good idea, so now I'm going to make you do it. No, it just happens. As long as you provide for a peaceful environment, redress of grievances, a justice system, defense against invasions of property and life, and so forth, just leave people alone. They will develop free markets. They begin to say, I can't just put a crown on my head and wrap a robe around myself and declare myself king. People just laugh at me. So I guess I have to go out and produce something and offer it to them. And then we both are winners. So free markets do flow naturally from human nature, from rationality, from people wanting to do better. And you're going to do that far more effectively in cooperation with others than you would as a Robinson Crusoe on a deserted island. Now, once again, I've kind of misplaced the second part of your question. You got me wound up.
No, for sure. That's good. That's good. As far as the individualism and collectivism, how does it impact that?
Well, I think, collectivism, I wouldn't say that invariably it is evil or poison. It tends to be that if it's imposed by force. But we have all of us, in fact, as individuals at one time or another have chosen to act in sort of collective ways. We come together and form a Boy Scout troop or a church or any number of things. And we decide, for instance, that important decisions that have to be made will be done in consultation or by voters. We choose sometimes to involve ourselves with others in a kind of collective way. I have no problem with that. That's, I think, natural and expected. as far as the introduction of force, though, that's where I would draw the line. People should be free to choose to collaborate peacefully, but they should not, if they get frustrated or get what they think is a better idea, they shouldn't grab the club and start beating people over the head and say, now you're going to do this because I think it's better than whatever you wanted to do. That looks like socialism, but it runs counter to human nature.
Man, I wish we could have you here for so long, because I want to dive into, there is a connection going on right now between collectivism, social justice, Marxism, and socialism. Maybe we'll be able to get into that in a little bit, but if not, I'm going to recommend to our readers, you have a chapter that really digs into that a good bit. And so the book, Was Jesus a Socialist? I want to highly recommend that. But as we're beginning to wrap up here, or head toward the wrapping up, at least, I'm going to close like the old school preachers. This is my first closing. And so, one of your unique contributions to this topic is the theological contribution. And your book is titled Was Jesus a Socialist? Now, on the one hand, it's like, man, are people really making that claim with a straight face that Jesus was a socialist? But you actually quote people, yes, they are making that. What are they? Who are these folks that are making that claim, and on what basis are they saying this?
Well, I think invariably they are socialists themselves, and they are trying to lay claim to Jesus as one of theirs, even though an amazing number of socialists don't really believe. They're not believers, but they love to say, oh, but Jesus will be one of us if we believed in him. That's another subject, I guess.
Yes.
But I think they're smart enough to be reasonably good marketers, and they realize, about 2.3 billion people on the planet call themselves Christian. And more than half of the American people, easily more than half, claim to be of Christian faith. So if they're going to implement socialism, they either better overcome that, or they have to claim, oh, it's compatible with our message. So that sets them off in all kinds of directions. But I'm convinced that the overwhelming majority of socialists who make that claim that Jesus was a socialist haven't really done their homework and actually read the New Testament. They just sort of think, oh yeah, didn't he say he wanted to help the poor? Oh, well, then he's a socialist. Even though there's more help for the poor under capitalism than there is under socialism. So they're grasping at straws to try to claim that Jesus was a socialist. But I can find nothing in the New Testament, none of the words of Jesus or any of the apostles, any of the leaders of Christianity, that would support the ethics or the teachings of any variety of socialism. Jesus never said, oh, well, here we got these 5,000 people we got to feed. Well, let's go find some rich people to steal from and we'll redistribute their stuff. No, he created wealth using his own unique power to feed the 5,000. He said he came to uphold the law, and that includes thou shalt not steal, which doesn't go on to say unless you have a really good idea about what to do with it, or thou shalt not steal unless the other guy has more than you do. Jesus also told parables that had a strongly economic content that supported things like private property, voluntary contract, honest dealings. And he never advocated the political redistribution of force. Never said, oh, the state over here, that's their job. Let them take care of the poor. I mean, the whole story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus told is that a man of his own free will and with his own resources chose to help a man. If the Samaritan had said to the guy in need, oh, sorry, somebody else will take care of it, or it must be a government program for you, we would think of him today as the good-for-nothing Samaritan.
So good. I've heard and I've seen some tweets of people just kind of tweeting, but Jesus condemned the rich and he came for the poor and the downtrodden. And of course, and on that note, how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, remember the context in which he was talking about these things. This was Roman-occupied Palestine. It was not in any way, quote, democratic. And if you were wealthy at that time, chances are it was because of your political connections. And the corruption among political officials was extremely extensive. Jesus never said that whether or not you can be saved depends on how much money you have.
Come on.
He never said if you earn up to this much, you're okay, but if you earn more than that, well, then you're in trouble. He never said anything like that. He was looking instead at your heart, at your soul. How do you deal with people? So I hope that answers your question, but
Yes, it does.
socialists are so misled, or have chosen to be misled when they claim that, he did warn that riches, I should say, richness comes with some temptations. And he would certainly say the same about power, which is what socialists are trying to accumulate all the time. He said, okay, just be careful if you become rich that you don't allow your riches to rule you. Don't forget your priorities. Don't worship your wealth. Well, that doesn't mean don't be wealthy. It just says handle it well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I love the chapter you have where you go through the three parables, including the Good Samaritan. But, because sometimes you read those and you don't dig very deep, especially the one where he hires the different workers throughout the day and gives them all the same, was it a denarius? And you might walk away from that thinking, oh, equal pay, but it's actually the exact opposite. What's going on there. Can you just briefly give us an explanation of that parable?
Yes, told by Jesus himself. He talks about a man who owns a vineyard, and he realizes he's got to hire workers to help bring the harvest in before it rots. And first thing in the morning, he hires a group of workers and offers to pay them a denarius. And then a little later on in the day, say about noon, he realizes, gee, I've got to get more people in the field to bring the crop in. So he hires some additional workers. Now, they're going to work maybe half as much as the first group, but he offers them the same, a denarius. And then at the end of the day, with maybe an hour to go before dark, the man hires a few more workers and says, I know there's not much left of the day, but if I can get you out to work, I'll give you a denarius. Then later, all these workers come together, and the first group says, this is not fair. He paid us the same, and we worked all day. Those guys at the end, they worked an hour, and they get the same. Well, if Jesus were a socialist, he would have the owner of the vineyard saying, oh, yeah, you're right. That's not fair. I got to make sure you all get the same equal pay on an hourly basis. But no, he doesn't. What Jesus has the vineyard owner saying is, hey, it's my money. Didn't I pay you what I promised? Didn't you sign a contract? Didn't you agree? This is and basically says, get out of here. In good faith, I paid each of you what I offered you, which is a stunning defense of private property, of voluntary contract. And I think too, as an economist, probably supply and demand. At the end of the day, how many people after already working at their other jobs want to turn out to work for some guy they don't know for another hour? You probably have to pay them a premium. So Jesus was presenting a parable there that no socialist could tell.
Yeah, no, that's it. And you also do the parable of the talents, which is instructive about how he actually, the guy that he gives 5 to, uses it well. He gives 5 more, and even takes from the one that he gave 1 to that didn't use it well and gave it to another. And that's right. Like in every way, it's the opposite. But one of the quotes, I think even on your PragerU video, I saw in the comments that someone was responding to you saying, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." Isn't that clear enough? And in other words, I think they were trying to imply that, whatever the government asks us, if it's socialism or tax, we just need to do it. Or sometimes the thought is, well, Christianity has nothing to do with politics. It's a separate sphere. So as Christians, we just need to go along and do whatever they tell us, get in line, be that socialism or whatever it might be. What are your thoughts on when Jesus said that? How should we understand that?
Yeah, socialists love to take that phrase, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's, and twist that into some kind of endorsement for just about anything that Caesar wants to take, and no matter what he wants to use it for. Does anybody who understands the teachings of Jesus for one moment believe that Jesus was in effect saying, oh yeah, if Caesar says it's his, well, you got to give it to him. It doesn't matter, what he spends it on either. So if he wants it all, well, it must be his. Jesus would never say that. It would be completely incompatible with everything else he taught about honest dealings and private property and respect for the lives and property of other people. Understanding the context here, again, is very important. The Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus into saying something that they could run to the Roman authorities and claim was tax evasion. They wanted him to say, oh, no, don't give Caesar. They would have loved it if he had said, don't pay your taxes, revolt against Caesar. But he didn't say anything like that. What he said was a very clever response, which actually left the matter up to us to decide what is the proper function of government, how much should it take. He says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Well, that could be nothing. Maybe nothing is his. He didn't say that, no, a certain amount is Caesar's for sure. He says, render it unto Caesar if it's his, and to God if it's his. But he leaves it to us to make such decisions as, well, how much should government rightfully take? So it's not some blanket endorsement of whatever some dictator wants to take from people, but the socialists would love you to think that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's really good.
Powerful stuff. I love that.
So one of the softer claims that people will sometimes make, well, maybe Jesus wasn't a socialist, but doesn't the Bible, doesn't biblical theology imply socialist or progressive policies? You know, isn't that the compassionate thing to do? Shouldn't, as Christians, we should be compassionate? Socialism's compassionate, therefore socialism is Christian in that sense. What's kind of your response to that?
Well, of course, the way socialism operates, there's nothing compassionate about it except the promises that it makes. But the means by which it attempts to achieve its compassion is force. It's vilification of the productive. It's seizure of their assets. It's a violation of private property. So it's only the rhetoric of socialism that seems to be compassionate, not the actual means. And of course, we know from decades of welfare state policies in America that those policies actually did a great deal of harm. They broke families apart. They paid people to split because they'd get more money. They encouraged intergenerational dependency. And then politicians use those programs to buy votes.
Okay, in your last chapter, you bring up an author of mine that I adore, C.S. Lewis, and another author, J. Gresham Machen, as two theologians who got it right. Overall,
Yes.
What did these two gentlemen contribute to this topic of socialism? Would you like to expound?
Yeah, I share with you a great love of C.S. Lewis. What a remarkable man. One of those people you wish you could go back in time and spend an hour with. And J. Gresham Machen, same way. Well, both of these gentlemen were serious Christian thinkers. And they also were fighters against the what they call the progressive drift within mainstream Christianity in their day, which continues to this day. They felt that the Word of God is inerrant and it's in Scripture, and you don't make stuff up to fit some political agenda, and that you should seek to understand it by studying it, not by just saying, well, it's just, whatever makes us feel good, let's just superimpose it on what we think God wants us to do. They were very serious Christian theologians. When they talked about government, both men who did not know each other, both men understood that at the core of humanity is the serious flaw of sin, and it's something that afflicts us all. We are not perfect creatures. And they both understood that the last thing you'd want to do is to give an imperfect creature prone to the desire to cheat or lie or steal. You don't want to give that person or any person the kind of power that would channel that destructiveness into great harm on the rest of society. So they instinctively, even though they weren't political philosophers, but with their understanding of Christian teaching and human nature, they realized God did not expect us as humans to concentrate power in earthly government. That's a prescription for disaster. They both argued that in their own way. And that's one of many reasons I admire them. But even if they'd never said anything about government, I think they were just great theologians, great lovers of the Bible.
Forgive me, if you could make one comment towards the church, and why should we be aware of this worldview of socialism? Lots of people, I think, will be voting and have no clue what socialism is, but how will socialism affect the church? Or historically, how has it affected the church?
I think if you get socialism, the church is in great danger, because socialists, especially the secular ones, which I think comprise the majority of socialists, they see Christianity as a competitor. Christianity draws people to another source of power, namely God, and that competes with politicians and their programs. And Christians who are really understanding of the Bible don't like to be pushed around, and yet they will be under a socialist regime because of that inherent tension between secular power that's concentrated and the power that each of us as individual Christians derive from our faith in the Almighty. People in the church should not sit idly back. I'm not telling anybody how to vote, but when it comes to this battle of ideas, we cannot afford to allow earthly power to be concentrated in the hands of the secular state. That is poison for all people, not just Christians. And we should, I think we're called to do and to fight for what we know to be right, no matter the odds of success or the obstacles that are in our way.
That's really good.
Amen.
And so, you know, they can get more of your stuff at, is it fee.org, FEE.org?
Yes, fee.org, or I have a personal website where everything I have on fee.org is put in one place. That's lawrencewreed.com. Either way, you can see my stuff and hopefully enjoy what I write.
And here I want to point our listeners real quickly here as well to your book, Was Jesus a Socialist? And get that on Amazon. I even want to recommend, just if you're in your church and you have a life group or a Sunday school,
so good.
Go through this book in the next couple months. It's so important for right now. I think we're on the cusp of making some very important decisions in our nation that are going to have long-lasting impact. So get this book, be informed, be a student, seek truth, seek God, and I think, we'll all be better for it. Well, thank you, Dr. Reed.
Thank you
so much for
so good.
Man, for just doing your ministry, doing what you do, for writing this book, and for coming on this podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you both. It's been a great honor, and I've enjoyed every minute.
All right, now the for real close here, and actually we're going to toss this to our Patreon listeners. But the question we're going to ask you is, if we see a Biden-Harris election in November, do you think that they will take steps towards socialism? So that's going to be our Patreon question. If you are interested, you can sign up for we'll have the link below.